Great. All right, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Dan Rundy. I'm with CSIS. I'm the director of the Project on Prosperity and Development. Really appreciate you all taking time out of your schedules to be with us today. We have a very special program. The topic is Connected Capitalism and the Opportunity for the United States. We have two very distinguished speakers. We have Mr. Neville Isdell, who's the former, he always says to say, to ensure I underline, former chairman and CEO of the Coca-Cola Company, and is the person who coined the term connected capitalism. And we also have Ambassador Stu Eizenstat, who's had a distinguished career in public service and is as well as in private practice as a lawyer. And the topic, connected capitalism, the term that was coined by Neville Isdell 2 years ago in 2009 in a speech he gave in New York City, approximately about 2 years ago today. And this has been a term that was built upon and has been developed further with the help of some very good friends who are actually here in the audience. We have the folks from the World Affairs Council, Wayne Lord and Cedric Sussman, and a very strong contingent of leaders from Atlanta who've flown up today to be with us. We have Dr. Mark Becker, who's the president of Georgia State University, and a number of other business leaders here. David Abney, who's the chief operating officer of UPS, is here with us. So I think it's been, a fair to say, a collective effort from a number of business leaders here in the United States, but also in Atlanta. And so we're really pleased that Atlanta has come to Washington to help us have this conversation. So this is great. But what is connected capitalism? It's Mr. Isdell's proposal for the way that companies need to engage societies across communities, institutions, social challenges, and values. And Neville, I keep calling him Mr. Isdell, but he keeps telling me to call him Neville, so I'm working on that. So Neville saw this as, he coined this response at the height of the financial crisis, at a moment of a crisis of legitimacy in capitalism. And it's his proposed response that companies need to take on to respond to this crisis of legitimacy in capitalism. I think Neville has had a number of roles in addition to being the former chairman and CEO of the Coca-Cola Company that allows him and gives him a unique perspective on this. He's on the board of the World Wildlife Federation. He's been the past chair of the International Business Leaders Forum in the UK. He's also co-chair of the Investment Climate Facility, and so has perspectives from civil society, business, and government on this. So, but I'm going to also, so I'll stop there, and I'm going to ask Neville to make some comments about connected capitalism, and then I'm going to ask Ambassador Eizenstat to give some remarks about what the opportunity might be for the public sector. Since we're here in Washington, that would seem to make a lot of sense. Neville, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Dan, and thank you all for being here today. I don't want to, in a way, totally regurgitate something that's 2 years old, because I think to some degree, we've moved on with regard to that, and I think the world and society has moved on. And I want to try and make my comments reasonably brief, because I want to get into Q&A on it. I think that's more dynamic and much more productive very often. But let me go all the way back to telling you that one of the things that happened when I was at university is I actually qualified as a social worker. And that obviously, therefore, there's a line of sight there through to where I am with regard to societal involvement, societal commitment. But I also made a decision at that time. Part of it was economic, because if you look what a social worker's salary is, my lifestyle, or my projected lifestyle, was certainly above that. But it was more than that. I actually believed, as I came into contact with the sons, really, of businessmen, that I was going to be able to do more from a societal standpoint, actually working in business, than I was as a social worker. And that evolved over 4 years at university. I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement in Cape Town as well. So I'm very engaged with society. But over then, the 43 years that I spent with the Coca-Cola Company, I've watched business operate in very different ways. I've been disappointed very often in the way that business has actually taken advantage of society, but I've also seen how the real growth, the real bringing people out of poverty is brought about by the investments that are made by businesses and by very positive investments in businesses. And don't forget, I was brought up in Africa, and when I was in the Philippines, worked on a piece actually with looking at the multiplier effect. Did that with actually the University of South Carolina. And the idea was looking at the wall had come down, and therefore you had a sort of a virginal situation where you were able to look at the investments that were going in to a society that was suddenly becoming capitalistic. And for example, as the Coca-Cola company built a bottling plant, not only the sourcing materials in terms of building the plant, but obviously there were advertising materials, so you had people starting up little advertising shops. You had retailers who were now starting to sell the product. And they identified that for every job, this was Romania and Poland, those are the two places we took. For every job that was started in the Coca-Cola bottling plant, there were actually around 11, or actually in Romania, 15 jobs in the society as a whole. So that's the standard frame of reference about how business creates value for society. But particularly if you go back to 2009, and Dan's referred to the financial crisis, it really hit me that we were starting to lose the legitimacy with society as a whole, what I hesitate to call social license, because that has a slightly negative context, but describes it pretty well. We were losing the social license to operate because of the rogues within society. And at the same time, some of the research that we were doing, and don't forget, this is an evolution. It didn't just happen in 2009. It didn't just happen to me. It was an evolution was taking place. But I was obviously looking at research about younger generation coming through and how values were playing a far greater role in terms of how they viewed corporations and how they viewed brands. Looking behind the brand and say, what do you really stand for? And just as importantly, the young employees in the organization felt the same way. And in fact, because of, when I took over in 2004, because of some issues the company had, there were people who didn't want to go work for the Coca-Cola company because of their perceptions about the value system of the Coca-Cola company at that time. But that was right or wrong, not the issue, but that was the way it was. So I then put that in other boxes about, because don't forget I was involved with some NGOs, the IBLF being one of them at that time. And it was clear that there was something evolving with regard to with NGOs and civil society. You had the UN Global Compact for a start. But also you had a number of NGOs, particularly in the area of climate change, who were saying, well, to some degree we've actually made our point. Let's take the issue of water, which is the one that was the Coke issue. You've made your point. We've made our point. How do we actually make a difference? How do we make some change? Well, there's one way. You work with governments in terms of legislation. That's prescriptive. It's needed in some instances, but it doesn't create any level of engagement. It doesn't get the broader society involved. And equally, I also, because the way I operated, but the way I'm sure everyone in this room has operated, looked at the people within Coca-Cola who were all, yes, working for the Coca-Cola company, but in their private time, they were actually involved in doing pro bono work for society. It may just have been coaching a school baseball team, but it may well have been something with their church. It may well have been something to do with Habitat for Humanity or other organizations like that. How did we connect that? Because we had the silos. NGOs, civil society, and I put academia in here, I put the UN as straddling it to governments. Governments and businesses, when they all could bring something to the party to bring about change, and yet they were actually in more of an adversarial position than a cooperative position. But there were real needs that had to be addressed. And as I say, you had to look at, from the Coca-Cola standpoint, water as being the key one. Because the last point I want to make, and then I'm going to hand over to Stu, is that unless the issue that the business is involved in is key to strategy. In other words, it's fundamental to the needs of the business. It will not continue to be a program that is pursued. It will be, in many respects, the individual pet project of the CEO or the spouse of the CEO, and it will change when the CEO changes. But if you take water for the Coca-Cola company, it's part of the product. It's integral. So therefore, it's absolutely clear that engagement in the issues of water in society and the ability of Coca-Cola to make a difference within that was something that we had to be engaged in. So it has to be, I call it line of sight. It has to be absolutely clear with regard to the strategy of the company. And what that means in many ways, and I'll stop here, just drop this pebble in the pond, is actually we've moved somewhat, there's a role for philanthropy, and then we've had corporate social responsibility. As I see it, this is another move to SRC, the socially responsible corporation. And that, I think, is the next phase of that evolution. And that requires then this reinforcing of what I call the triangle of sustainability, the way that governments, civil society, and businesses work together to address these global issues.
Thanks, Neville. Ambassador Eizenstat, you're a native Atlantan as well, so it's you've also been a collaborator with Neville Isdell on Connected Capitalism. You've also been involved with a number of tri-sector partnerships with British Petroleum or with BP, along with around forestation issues. What's the opportunity for Connected Capitalism?
Thank you. With your permission, Neville has both physical and professional stature to be able to make his points while sitting. To
yes, please.
I'm going
please do that.
It's really a pleasure to be here, and this is Atlanta going north for a number of us. I very much appreciate, by the way, seeing Dave Abney, who's my colleague at UPS and whose board I'm privileged to sit being here. Let me try to put this first in a historical context, and then bore down on Neville's very creative suggestion. With the end of the Cold War and the demise of communism, there were really three surviving international political economic models. The first and most successful was what some call the Anglo-Saxon model, based on the US and UK, but also practiced in countries as disparate as Japan, Chile, South Korea, and Australia, which was characterized by strong democratic political institutions, laissez-faire free market economic structures, relatively low taxes, sound fiscal and monetary policy, light government regulation with an emphasis on self-regulation of business. And the second system would be called the social democratic model, which I saw up front when I was ambassador to the EU in Brussels. And that is more of a European model. It combines the same robust democratic political structures as the Anglo-Saxon model, but generally has higher levels of social welfare programs, including stronger safety nets and universal health insurance. They use a precautionary principle for environmental regulation, and in general have a heavier degree of government regulation and higher tax levels to pay for the social programs. These economies tend to be, over the last decade and a half or so, less dynamic and innovative than the Anglo-Saxon models. But both, again, provide strong rules of law, protections for intellectual property, an independent judiciary, a free press, an active civil society, and strong human rights and free speech protections. The third model would be characterized by China and, to a degree, Russia, and that is what some would call authoritarian state capitalism, which combines an authoritarian political system, heavy state ownership or control over major parts of the economy, some limited openness to foreign investment, but with key conditions like transfers of technology, limitations on takeovers, as Coca-Cola itself witnessed when it tried to acquire a Chinese fruit juice company, strategies that require state agencies and state-owned companies to favor domestic technology, and weak intellectual property protections. Now, the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, for reasons which are obvious, dealt a very heavy blow to the Anglo-Saxon model. But cracks in that model were already showing up beforehand. For example, the first decade of this century, the 2000s decade, was the worst economic decade since World War II. Average household wealth declined by 4%, something never seen in any decade since World War II. Average household wealth had always increased since the Great Depression. And it was equivalent in a way to the lost decade of Japan in the 1990s. And there was high income inequality. So Neville Isdell to the rescue, because what Neville has tried to create is a new free market capitalist model, but one which has a very different corporate business NGO relationship that I think is very much suited to the 21st century and avoids what some would take from the difficulties of the Anglo-Saxon model, that is moving to protectionism, to restrictions on trade, to more heavy-handed regulation, which is not the solution. And I think Neville's creativity is in seeing that corporations are moving from corporate social responsibility, which itself is a step forward, to really integrating the achievement of the betterment of society as a part and parcel of profitability. That this is not an adjunct to, it is an integral part of corporate behavior. So the question then really is, what's the role of government in this new model which has been laid out by Neville? And in a recent Harvard Business School article, Michael Porter really takes Neville's concept up and calls it shared value, which is the concept, again, of embedding into the corporation, creating social value, solving social problems as part of the corporate ethic and competitiveness. Let me suggest some models that government needs to adapt to in the same way that Neville has been so creative on the corporate side. The first is recognizing, particularly in an era of austerity and limits of federal budgets, the need to leverage corporations and NGOs to help in the solution of problems. And let me give you some specific examples, because I think all the major problems we're facing require this kind of corporate NGO government cooperation. First, there's been a recent proposal by Senator Kerry of a public-private initiative for an infrastructure bank. We all know that our infrastructure is crumbling, that our roads, our sewer systems, our railroads and so forth are not up to 21st century standards, but we don't have the money in the federal government, stimulus packages or no stimulus packages, to even begin to come close to the need. So what he suggested was, in effect, seed money, $50 billion, that would leverage 5, 6, 7 times that in private investment, and then there would be a sort of public-private board that would rule on projects. You'd get away from the pork barrel efforts that occur with Congress allocating earmarks, and profits and risk would be shared. There are also other structures that have been created. When I was ambassador to the EU, we created a new transatlantic agenda with the European Union that was the sort of political framework that still exists for the relationship, but the business-government relationship was when we created in 1995, and with Ron Brown, the late Ron Brown, and which still exists to this very day, the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, and Neville was very active in that with coca-cola. Under the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, major corporations on both sides of the Atlantic make recommendations to the European Union and to the US in a structured format. And these recommendations are taken very seriously by government. Government and the private sector are really partners in trying to reduce barriers to trade and investment on both sides of the Atlantic. In the last year or two of the Bush administration, now continued and strengthened with Mike Froman's leadership in the Obama administration, the Transatlantic Economic Council was created, and the TABD, the business side, interacts directly and regularly with the Transatlantic Economic Council, which is the government component, to feed in recommendations on how to harmonize regulations, how to reduce barriers to investment and trade, and it really works. I just participated a couple of days ago in the advisory board created for APEC, the APEC summit coming up in Honolulu in November. Very important summit in which we need to reassert our leadership in Asia. And the Business Advisory Group is there to feed in recommendations and work intimately with the administration in shaping the agenda for the APEC summit. It's not just an afterthought, it's really built into the whole structure of the APEC summit. There are other fora that have done this. For example, and Neville mentions it in his seminal article about this, and that is the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum in Davos with Klaus Schwab brings together through panels and seminars looking at almost every issue, government and business and NGOs in one forum to discuss ideas and to break down the kind of adversarial relationships that Neville has quite clearly indicated have to be changed if we're going to solve these problems. Another example of corporate new behavior, what I would call connected capitalism, using his term, or shared values, is the U.S. CAP group that has brought together 25 major corporations and NGOs to deal with climate change. And they're way ahead of where our politicians are on dealing with climate change, and have made it a matter of their corporate activity, not just a good thing and a nice thing to do. I mean, Coca-Cola just announced 2 weeks ago with H.J. Heinz, Bill Johnston, and your successor, Mukhtar Kent, it's the new Coca-Cola plant bottle, which uses much less, in fact, ultimately will use no CO2 emitting products, sort of gets away from plastics. And Heinz is going to use this for its ketchup product. Now, this is a perfect example of connected capitalism. It is for the good of shareholders, but it's also for the good of broader stakeholders in society. And this kind of initiative is important and needs to be encouraged. There are many other examples. The Dodd-Frank bill is a way of trying to deal with some of the loss of trust that occurred because of excessive financial activity, and I think that's important too. And I find on my corporate boards, including UPS, that there is more and more discussion of social issues, of political issues, of diplomatic issues that are incorporated into this. And Dan mentioned BP. I wish they had done this in the Gulf, but they did it in creating a 4-person commission, of which I was one, in proposing publicly how they could build the so-called BTC pipeline, Baku, Tbilisi, Ceyhan pipeline, 1,700 kilometers to bring oil and gas for the Caspian Sea in the most environmentally safe and sound system. You got 4 independent people. We made recommendations after talking to NGOs and stakeholders and governments in the region, and then made those recommendations to the government. Then the last point, and that is government and the private sector can collaborate, but they still have different roles. There are always going to be different sources of tension, because even under Neville's really brilliantly conceived model, the still bottom line in order to make connected capitalism work is to bring value to shareholders while doing social good. Government's role is somewhat different, and I see it as setting a framework in which this kind of connected capitalism can work. The first is making sure, which we did not do in the past 8 years, and that is abiding by our own model, our Anglo-Saxon model, which made it effective, and that is fiscal integrity at the federal level to encourage fiscal integrity at the household level. It is to make sure that when we regulate only when we have to, only with the least cost alternative, and only after involving business in that regulation to make sure we're doing so in a sensible way, setting general goals and performance standards, leaving it wherever possible to the businesses to determine the best way to comply with those regulations. That doesn't mean no regulation. We deregulated airlines in the Carter administration. It's one of the things that I think was the most successful domestic program in which I was involved in many ways. Over the objection, by the way, of all the major airlines who liked the regulation just fine because it protected any new entries. But when we did deregulate, we didn't end safety regulation. You still have to have safety regulation as well. So I think government has as much to learn from what Neville has talked about on the corporate side, and we have to do our part on the government side to recognize that the new paradigm that Neville is laying out for corporations has to be matched with a sensitivity on the government side to allow room for the connected capitalism that he has proposed. And hopefully now during the question period we'll be able to get into this in more detail. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. There was this discussion about an adversarial relationship. I think those of you that have worked in government or worked in the private sector or the civil society would say there's been an evolution in the way in which the various sectors relate to each other. And I think Neville and I were having a discussion as part of a podcast interview earlier today, and we were talking about the UN Global Compact, and we were talking about Greenpeace. I just thought, Neville, if you would just speak, if you would, to just some of those experiences, because I think 10 years ago you wouldn't have been a signatory to the UN Global Compact if you had been at the time the CEO of the Coca-Cola company, or perhaps you would have, but 20 years ago you might not have been. And then you talked about addressing Greenpeace, which I just was floored by just a couple of years ago. If you could just talk to those two examples.
Well, that was really an anecdotal piece in terms of just describing, because you asked me the question, you know, how is this moving along? And it's perceptions changing on both sides. And it was before the Olympics in Beijing, about 6 months before that. It must be nearly 4 years ago. I was, they told me, the first CEO of a major corporation to address a Greenpeace conference. And they embargoed actually any press release on that at that time, because that was actually very controversial within Greenpeace. But it was also related to the fact that it was about CFCs, and it was about refrigeration, it was about discharge into the atmosphere, and it was about a joint program with Greenpeace, which, let's remember, had actually started from protests from Greenpeace. I mean, these things don't always just happen serendipitously and through very nice interpersonal relationships, okay? There's a real world out there. But what happened was that a couple of people within Greenpeace and some people within Coke, and it was my predecessor, Doug Daft, who actually started this, said, well, okay, you know, if we really want to solve this, we need to sit around the table. And that was how that evolved. And it has brought forward new technology, not just with regard to CFCs, brought new technology in terms of the ability. Coke has about, I think, somewhere around 9 million pieces of refrigeration around the world. There's a device that was developed that reduces energy by 35%, energy use by 35%. And that little micro really demonstrates how you can contribute to a major societal issue, CFCs, or CO2 into the atmosphere, something which governments are obviously trying to legislate as well. Do that productively with a testy NGO, but also to the benefit of the business as well, because you're not just reducing societal impact, but you're also reducing your own usage particularly in terms of power, in terms of a 35% saving. So now it doesn't always work out that well. I mean, sometimes there are things that only are on the cost side, but then there are others that will mitigate on the profit side as well. So I just use that as an example of how the evolution has taken place. I think it's bigger and broader than that now. I mean, I just do. And to give you just one other example, pick up on Stu and governments, one of the things that I co-chair something that was set up really around Glen Eagles 2005 with Ben Mkapa, the former president of Tanzania. And it's an effort to bring about, it's enabling business in Africa. We're running projects in 13 countries at the moment in Africa. And it's addressing the micro rather than the macro. So it's about how do you bring about economic reform. For example, involved in paperless customs, involved in reforming of commercial courts, involved in land registration procedures, business registration procedures, end-to-end process reform with the governments. In this instance, this is a business-government connection funded by corporates and funded by the development agencies of governments, DFID, for example, out of the UK. But it's actually enabling not just the large businesses, but also more the SMEs. And I'll give you one example of a successful project, which is land registration in Burkina Faso. So I've chosen one that you all have been to Burkina Faso, so you know what I'm talking about. But it used to take, if Dan bought a piece of land from me, it would take 198 days and 28 signatures to get that piece of land transferred. And obviously some facilitation somewhere in the middle. Today, it's 30 days, actually it's 29 days, and 5 signatures. So it's an effort to say a lot of this is another area in a way, but a lot of the top-down stuff hasn't worked terribly well. And working on the micro and working on the way up and bringing about fundamental reform that way is another way of enabling the two to work together. Very strong protocols made with the government, very strong commitments made in terms of how their ministry, the relevant ministry, will actually perform. Real metrics in terms of, this is business people involved. Real metrics in terms of measuring success or failure, and creating a better environment over time for business as a whole.
Yeah, I'd like to, if I may, give you a couple of examples to elaborate on what government can do to enable the connected capitalism to work better. We're in a situation now on climate change, and I was the chief negotiator in the Clinton administration for the Kyoto Protocol, so it's something I'm very deeply interested in. Climate change legislation is dead for the foreseeable future. There's not going to be any. And Kyoto, as we know it, is dead. Now, what does government do? Well, maybe EPA regulation is something, but if the president and the administration use their bully pulpit to challenge business to make this a part of their connected capitalism, it would accelerate work that's already happened. I mentioned the plant bottle with Coca-Cola. I know from my board position with UPS that UPS is putting in hybrid vehicles as fast as they can, both because it's good for the environment and they want to do this because it also is good for their bottom line, Neville. It saves gasoline, it saves time, it's more productive, it's more efficient, and this is critical, and it's critical to the connected capitalism. It enhances the reputational value to the public of that brand, and in today's world, consumers have a lot of choices. They want to go to a company in whose general brand and reputation they have confidence. Again, another example, Walmart. If I said this 5 years ago, I'd be laughed out of this room. Walmart has become one of the most environmentally sensitive, CO2 sensitive companies in the world. The amount of their CO2 reduction is staggering. They've gone to white roofs on all of their buildings and on their supply chain. And there's no company in the world, with the exception perhaps of Coca-Cola, that has more leverage on a supply chain than Walmart. They have told everyone in their supply chain, raw material suppliers, nut and bolt suppliers, we want to see your specific commitments on CO2 reduction, on climate change, or you don't do business with us anymore. Now that is really corporate social responsibility taken to the next level. But if government incentivized that, it would really help as well. One last example, which involves Coca-Cola, and Neville was very much in the middle of making this happen. This involved a government, in this case not the US government, but the Indian government. And there were problems with the Indian government because farmers were complaining about water being taken by Coca-Cola that was hurting their, they said, agriculture. We think that may have been exaggerated, but they ended up doing an independent report that had credibility, and then that led to a new policy, which to me is connected capitalism, which they call water neutrality. They pledged in India and ultimately around the world that they will return in at least as good and probably better quality the water that they use. They will not use any additional water, net neutrality. And this is a great example, working with a government, in that case the Indian government and local governments, of connected capitalism. It worked for Coke, helped their reputation, it allows them to expand, it's good for the farmers, and it was good for the Indian government.
Absolutely. This has to be tied to the key business, the core business activities. Neville, you were going to say something about that.
Yeah, you know, in a broader frame of reference, this is now with my World Wildlife Fund hat on, but you all, I'm sure, look at TED on the net. If you go to TED and you look up Dr. Jason Clay, Jason Clay, who works at WWF, he did one of those 18-minuters in November last year. And basically, he's got a matrix about what, it's really the engagement strategy of the WWF with corporates. And he's looking at key commodities. Palm oil would be one, for example. And then the companies that are, and it'll be about 6 or 7 companies in terms of each of those commodities and their impact on the environment, and how that matrixes with regard to those being the companies that WWF wants to work with to look at how they develop programs to either neutralize, as we have in terms of the example that Stu's given, or certainly mitigate the impact they have with regard to those particular commodities, not just in their total supply chain. Okay. Part of what's come out of that is a move with the Consumer Goods Forum, which happens to be chaired by the head of Carrefour and also my successor, Muhtar Kent, who 3 months ago announced that by 2020 they would, Walmart's involved, Tesco, Pepsi's involved, Procter & Gamble, you know, it is the large corporates, but the Consumer Goods Forum represents 400 of the world's largest retailers and largest consumer goods companies, so it'll go beyond the 20. And that they will, this is to do with deforestation, that they will have negative impact on deforestation in terms of all of the products in their supply chain by 2020. So these are huge initiatives. These are very big asks if you look at the task ahead to be able to do that. So some of the stories we're telling you are small and anecdotal, and you say, well, that's a nice thing, but is there something systemic that's behind it? And I think if you look at that TED piece, and also a piece that Melinda Gates did as well, I think about a month or two later, just look up Melinda Gates on TED. I think you'll find both of those. That'll be 36 minutes of your time, and I think you'll find it very worthwhile.
Another example, if I may, of the role of government, because I don't want to make it seem benign that government is really the passive party in this. And I mentioned climate change again. The president can use the bully pulpit to encourage corporate behavior, but the best way to encourage corporate behavior is to send a price signal. I mean, that's really what motivates alternative investment. And as long as we have this impasse on the Hill of not being able in any way, shape, or form, even through a refundable tax that would reduce payroll taxes or cap and trade, unless and until we set a price for carbon, we're not going to get the kind of corporate behavior, even with connected capitalism, that will lead to a faster acceleration for alternative energy. So government has to sort of set a context as well and be a catalyst for corporate behavior. And if we don't do our part, we can't expect corporations to pick up all of the slack.
I want to open it up. We have a very informed audience, and so we've got some microphones here, I believe. And the gentleman up here in the front row, you can identify yourself in the form of and just speak into the microphone.
Joe Reeder. This just follows up on your comment, Stu, about what government can do. It seems to me that one huge thing that government can do as a catalyst, focusing on profitability, is to make the focus more long-term life cycle profitability as opposed to short-term what happened to the stock market today, shareholder kind of thing. And the way to do that, one very important way to do that, is how we procure. We procure over $500 billion worth of stuff every year. And if you buy automobiles for a transportation motor pool, the seller of the automobiles is actually incented for the automobiles to be replaced frequently. If you procure transportation, that's different, because the victim of cars that break down or burn more fuel is the seller. Same thing with an air conditioner. Same thing with furniture. If you procure furnishing for this suite of the Pentagon as opposed to chairs and whatnot, and you have to do the life cycle, the environmental life cycle of that, you've completely changed the behavior of the corporate world, because now you're buying something that does force them to focus on a life cycle profitability.
Well, one thing on the, Neville can talk better than I can on the issue of long-term profitability versus short-term quarterly profits, and I think the whole issue of earnings calls and all of that leads to this kind of short-term behavior, Joe. But I'm on a French-American corporate board, and I'm not proposing this is a good solution, but it is interesting just to mention. Under French law, long-term shareholders of private corporations get double voting rights. And it is at least an effort to try to encourage long-term shareholder involvement. Again, there may be other ways to do it, but it's an interesting notion of trying to incentivize shareholders to hold on to their stock and not and be long-term shareholders in the company.
Neville?
I think it's a great issue. I really do. Who's the shareholder? If you're CEO of a quoted company, who's the shareholder that you answer to? Is it the day trader who's in and out of the stock? I mean, that's just taking it down another level in terms of the example that you give. Now, theoretically, it is, but their interest is purely one tick, one way or the other. I had the good fortune to have the largest single investor in the Coca-Cola company be Warren Buffett. And those are the investors that you want. So that's where Stu's headed. And I think quarterly earnings are detrimental. There's enough transparency, I think, that you don't have to force those, because you just make... I've made presentations on long-term strategy to stock analysts, and they go to sleep. They really want to know, what numbers have you got for me to feed into my computer model that's going to give me what I think the stock price is going to be in a week, if not 3 months, 6 months, maximum, long-term sort of 9 months. So you see David Abney here nodding his head. I think we're in a very dysfunctional system with regard to that. And I think some change there is important. Just on your specific, I actually think that businesses buy better than governments, because governments, because of public tender, very often have to buy the lowest price, and the lowest price doesn't have the whole equation there in terms of what is actually the whole life cycle, and also also the impact. And certainly I think most of us in business will always look at the quality of what we're buying, which means that therefore we actually will be willing to pay a premium, because we actually take a look at the overall life cycle of that. Now, do we look at the environmental impacts? We have not, but I think that we're moving towards that in many respects as well.
There's several hands over here. The gentleman, almost the last row, and the one. Yeah.
Thank you. It's Dana Marshall with Julian LaBeouf. And thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I had maybe 1.5 or 2 questions, if I can sneak those in.
You make it 2. It's okay.
I'll make it 2. Stu, thank you very much, as always, for shortcutting through a lot of sort of economic history of this world and mentioning these models now that have evolved. I wonder if I could intersect a couple of things that we've talked about already today. I guess you also mentioned that Walmart is a great force for moving this forward because they are requiring their vendors to comply with their own requirements. And that works fine for, let's say, in China, foreign investment enterprises that are there. They're going to pick up on either their home companies' policies or because they are producing for a brand, under the trademark of that company. But as we see, we're going to see more and more Chinese companies themselves with international marks and doing their own work. I wonder, maybe this is a question for Stu, is how do you see that third model, sort of the China consensus model, the Beijing consensus, as applying in this case? Are they as concerned, or might they be as concerned on reputation? Certainly they're concerned about efficiency issues and cost. What's the best way to kind of encourage that companies with that mindset? And I guess for Neville, there was a time when we talked about corporate social responsibility when we had a notion of accounting for that, where we could actually put together balance sheets, P&L statements, very familiar kinds of business statements. Is there some way that we could judge, or maybe even better, stockholders might be able to judge how companies are doing through standardized accounting kinds of statements that will show up companies that are with this model and without?
Ambassador Eizenstat, why don't you go first?
Well, first of all, I mean, on the China situation, I'm going to give an answer, but Neville probably can give an even better answer because he's spent so much time with Chinese companies. But let me take a stab at it, Dana. And Dana and I were colleagues in the Clinton Gore administration. First of all, China, the best thing we did in the Clinton administration, in my opinion, with respect to China, was getting him into the World Trade Organization and then getting MFN treatment, because it has put them and embedded them into a rules-based system. We can sue them, they can sue us, and through that system they are expected to come up to international norms, and they are increasingly doing so. Second, here's a good example of what I would call connected capitalism, and it's public, so I think I can mention it, and that is that a number of companies have complained, like Microsoft and others, about the theft of their intellectual property in China. What Microsoft then did, which was a big step for them, is they prepared a case study for the US government to document in detail the dimensions of the counterfeiting and theft of their software, which has led the US government to take a much more aggressive role, potentially to file some action in the WTO. That's their decision, but a much more aggressive role. Again, corporate government cooperation. Third, because China increasingly wants to be seen as itself being what Bob Zoellick called a good shareholder or stakeholder. Let's take climate change. They just came up with a 5-year plan, which they released at Davos, on what they will do to increase their carbon efficiency. Now, I negotiated with them at Kyoto. It was just miserable to deal with. I mean, they said, it's your problem. You created it through your industrial revolution. We're just starting ours. Just forget it. You want to take targets, don't bind us. Their position has evolved. They're at Cancun, willing to make commitments on corporate efficiency and CO2 efficiency, which will translate into at least modifying the curve on CO2 emissions. They're planting tens of millions of trees to absorb carbon and to help with the desertification of large parts of China, which they're very concerned about. So we're starting to see more and more of this, and what we need to do is embed them even further into this. For example, getting them into the OECD, encouraging them to sign up to the government procurement agreements. So these technology transfer things, they're really over the top grants and subsidized loans to buy up natural resources in the Sudan and other places. That would all be illegal under the OECD codes. So furthering embedding them into the international system will change gradually their behavior, and it's already beginning to change, although not as fast as one would like.
Neville, on this issue of corporate social responsibility and accounting for it.
Yeah, I just want to build, I agree totally with what Stuart just said. And I think you see a very distinct evolution with regard to China. By the way, one of the great failures of my career was as head of the U.S.-Russia Business Council, trying to get Russia to accede to the WTO. And I think that you see the way Russia, we need to bring Russia into that rule-based system, and we've seen the advantage of that with regard to China. But also just a Chinese comment. This must have been 4 years ago, as a World Economic Forum meeting with the Prime Minister. And it was 20 businessmen with the Prime Minister privately. And he outlined, obviously, their issues with regard to employment and the migration to the cities, etc. But what he said then, and you see it reflected now in the way they're moving, he said, you know, because we were challenging with regard to what they were about Kyoto and about what they were doing about the environment. He said, I understand. He said, you know, you've got to understand that when no one can fish in the rivers anymore, just like London in 1950s, because you know they all go back to history. I mean, they're great students of history, which I remember was true. And when people can't breathe the air, just like London in the 1950s, well, that's when people died from smog. He said it's a political problem, and we have to address it, and we will. And that was 4 years ago, and there's a huge change has taken place in the last 4 years. So I think China, and again, it's the same with, it'll be there with counterfeiting. It's to do with the reputational side of companies. You know, I'm on the GM board. We've got a partner, Shanghai Automotive, in a joint venture. I don't go back to the early days of that, but we were talking about it just yesterday, and how they now are sucking in from us all of the quality criteria that GM uses in terms of what they need to do, plus obviously all of the protocols we have around the environment as well. So it is happening. It won't happen as quickly as we all would like, and there are all sorts of rogue players that are still going to get away with lots of things, but I really do think it's happening with regard to China. In terms of measurement, I mean, the CSR reports still exist. I mean, and in fact, they're becoming much more detailed, much more specific. And I think actually that's the core of the reporting. And a standardized system, there are advantages and disadvantages. A standardized system sometimes sets up game playing because everyone tries to beat the system. And I think you need rather to look at a company and the company to report against where their impacts, not something that's globally standardized, because one size doesn't fit all. And let individual people judge that company in terms of what they're doing, in terms of where they have an overall impact, impact on society. And what you see now happening with regard to that is how competition moves things forward. Now, part of this is in the Porter article, because Porter's article is in a way narrower than my concept, because mine is about how we really address societal issues. He's looking at how societal issues can be addressed through the profit motive and through investments in new technologies. And I think that's absolutely valid. But Stu mentioned or was it Dan mentioned the plant bottle of Coca-Cola. Well, guess what? On my BlackBerry this morning, Pepsi's announced in 2 years' time they're going to, Coke is a 30% use of actual plant-based materials with 70% PET, with a goal to get to 100. Pepsi said in 2 years' time they're going to have 100% out there. Great game. It's what we want. It's capitalism in action. But it's also from all of the working that's taken place between the other players and what I call the triangle. And I'd rather focus on the mechanisms to make that work than prescriptive, and rely on the current CSR reports, even as we move to socially responsible corporations.
Other comments? The woman in the middle there.
Hi, thank you so much. This is very, very illuminating, especially because I don't have a background in business at all. I work at the UN Information Center. And we've mentioned the Kyoto Protocol. We've talked about these international agencies a little bit and the sort of framework that they can do. And I was wondering if you see the role of the UN and other organizations as taking a part in this framework, if they can be more active players, or if it is strictly a bilateral relationship between businesses and governments. Thank you.
Well, in fact, if you go back to Kyoto, you go back to Cancun, the recent meeting in Cancun, it was the failure of governments to agree that was the problem. Businesses were actually standing side by side with NGOs in terms of all of the issues around pricing carbon, etc. Now, there are some outliers there that businesses don't agree with that, but the businesses were actually advocating side by side with NGOs, which was, something you would never have pictured 5 years ago. It's the failure of governments, and really, and that is where Kyoto fell apart, and that is where any climate change legislation, I think, in the next 5 years is just not going to take place. There's no political leadership, there's no political will for that to happen. Stu, would you?
Yes, I mean, look, the UN obviously has a role both through things like the Global Compact, which Coca-Cola was a key participant in, and with respect to trade rounds and climate change negotiations. But with a very significant but, because in both instances, the UN requirement of quote-unquote consensus oftentimes makes agreement extremely difficult. At the Uruguay round, and now, which took 8 years, and now we're almost in our 10th year in the Doha round. The UN doesn't have through the WTO in this case, the WTO doesn't have the mechanisms to really force governments to make decisions. It is a sort of umbrella convening organization for trade rounds, as the UN has been with respect to climate change. Both have the requirement of consensus. Now, the only way in which even the more limited Cancun Declaration was achieved at the end of last year, and it was a step forward, sort of a bottoms-up approach, very different than Kyoto, but it was only achieved because the Mexican head of the Committee of the Parties at Mexico essentially refused to listen to Bolivia's objection and abandoned, with a sort of footnote, the consensus rule. So the UN's got to, if it wants to be relevant, it's got to find other mechanisms by which the lowest common denominator can't block progress that others are making.
Mr. Berg in the second row.
Bob Berg. Alas, my life is entirely NGO boards. I wanted to follow the opening of Mr. Isdell when you made reference to the economic crisis. And here, one of the interesting things is the difficulty of addressing a problem when the leaders in its own field have not addressed it. I was almost nostalgic for the earlier financial crises when Jim Robinson and Felix Rohatyn would speak out, and we didn't have that this time. It's hard to criticize one's own bankers, but what does one do when there's an allied field of such importance as finance, and finance leaders aren't taking leadership?
Well, I mean, I think there was put it this way, it was a black swan event, and I think it caught everyone very, very much by surprise. And you're sitting, I guess, in the situation that the Japanese government is sitting in right now, with an event which is so catastrophic, whereby no one knows exactly how to react to it. And I think we were all, everyone, I was still with Coke at the time. I know that there was a day where one of the major banks said we were the only commercial paper rollover that they were doing that day was the Coca-Cola one. Things were absolutely frozen. We were sitting there saying, well, what happens tomorrow? The 30-day rollover of commercial paper. We were deer in the headlights. I mean, absolutely. I think that, I'm careful of my words here, but this is not representing anyone but myself. I do think that the banks are not playing the role that they should play in society as a whole today, and I think that they have probably to some degree got free of causing tremendous tragedy to so many people in the world by their actions in a way that means that it can still be repeated. And I remember when we had it was long-term capital management and new legislation coming in then, and Warren Buffett saying, I'm not worried about you now, I'm worried about 7 years when everyone's forgotten about what happened with long-term capital management. And I think we're still there. I don't think we've actually got fundamental solutions to preventing. It'll be in a different form, but hopefully not of the same order of magnitude of what we saw. But I'm critical of financial institutions.
I'm going to give Ambassador Eizenstat the last word. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up because of some logistic issues. But Ambassador?
Well, this is actually a good one to wind up with, because I would call this disconnected capitalism.
Agreed.
And let me go back a little bit. When I was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury and Larry Summers was Secretary, we negotiated a bipartisan agreement which was called the Graham-Leach-Bliley Bill, and it ended 50 years of separation under Glass-Steagall of commercial and investment banking. And I still think it was the right thing to do. That's the way the world was moving. The notion that you could have these artificial divisions was really outmoded. It was a sort of 20th century idea. But what was lacking is to then recognize that we were in a new financial system and that we needed to have appropriate prudential regulation of that new system. And we didn't have that. And as a result, I mean, this is not a time to go into all the mortgage securitization and so forth, but we had behavior that was, by any standard, inappropriate capitalism. It was capitalism run wild. And so what happens under that system, in which everybody, including the rating houses, were negligent, is you end up getting the other side of the pendulum. You have to have a TARP, massive intervention, which makes the public angry as hell at their tax dollars going to bail out banks. It was the right thing to do. We had to do it to develop a meltdown, but you can't convince the average person of that. You end up with the Dodd-Frank bill, where the pendulum swings towards direct regulation and more, shareholder say on pay and play and all of that, pay and say and all of that. So when you have corporate behavior that's inappropriate, it leads to government activity which has to swing all the way to the other side. And what we need to learn as a lesson from that is Neville Isdell's Connected Capitalism. We can avoid these kinds of problems if we get together in every sector, including the financial sector, and say, look, what are the big challenges? How do we work together? How do we avoid an adversarial relationship? How do we regulate in a way that preserves the public integrity, but at the same time allows you to operate in ways that make a profit and are not interventionist and won't lead to a need for another TARP intervention?
Please help me thank the speakers.